When you close your eyes and you say, what is a watch? And not a smartwatch, a watch that's made out of metal, that is something you would wear when you are either trying to look nice or trying to look presentable or just getting dressed for the day. You probably either picture something that looks like a Submariner or that looks like a Datejust. In the very same way that when you close your eyes and say, picture a race car, you probably picture a Ferrari. Like Rolex managed to create the modern Platonic form of a watch.
Welcome back to The Materialist. I'm Marc Bridge, the founder and CEO of At Present, matchmaker to extraordinary jewelry, and I am your host. Today, I have the great pleasure of sitting down with both a great friend and a very thoughtful commentator on the world of all things material, Ben Gilbert. Ben, welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me. We have talked about doing something like this for a long time, and until the last week, have never had occasion to do it. So
that's true. The times where we would have had the occasion predate the Materialist podcast. I'm thinking of LVMH, I'm thinking of Hermes, potentially Porsche. I don't know if that fits into your universe enough, but yeah, the times where we've danced into your world, you weren't ready for us yet.
For those of our listeners who don't know you, would you give us a brief introduction to who is Ben? And maybe we'll use that as a segue into what is it about today in this conversation that makes this a relevant time?
You bet. I co-host a podcast called Acquired with our mutual great friend, David Rosenthal. It is a 4 to 5 hour podcast that comes out once a month where we try to understand how the world ended up the way that it did. Every single month, we chronicle the story of a company from founding to today. We analyze it. We try to figure out how it became such an outlier success. And if we've done our job really well, we create the canonical, definitive work, at least in audio form, about the company. And this past month, we did Rolex.
And I think it is probably fair to say that in the time that we have known one another, which is going on the better part of a decade now, which traces kind of the rise of Acquired, your universe has expanded a little bit. And if I think back to when we first met, I would say that you had a pretty utilitarian outlook on the world. I think that you were either knowingly or unknowingly a fervent fan of the Jeremy Bentham worldview, that everything could be described in terms of udals. If I don't do something today, that means that there's going to be a lot more of it in the future. And we had a lot of conversations about discounted cash flows and the present value of something into the future.
Marc is, of course, alluding to the fact that when we met, I don't think I was yet a venture capitalist, but I was about to become a venture capitalist. Also around this time, we should say, Acquired had around 1,000 listeners when we became friends. It was nothing. And now it's the #1 tech podcast and million+ listeners and all that. So you've been with me on quite the journey, I think, in how I view the world, but also my place in it.
Acquired started as an investigation of IPOs and M&As in tech companies in this very narrow world with this very kind of quantitative bent. And as it has grown, it's expanded enormously into telling broader stories and gone from the world of technology into the world of kind of everything in the world. Has that impacted the way in which you think about things?
Yeah, absolutely. The fun thing about owning a business where David and I are the sole shareholders is that we only do episodes on things we're interested in. And so you can trace my exact change in how I view the world by what has shown up on Acquired. These things are not like almost overlapping circles. They're identical overlapping circles. But to put a finer point, I think what the question you're getting at is, I definitely used to view the world as, I want to start a tech company. I'm starting little tech companies along the way to try to eventually create the one that's the good one and be able to take that public and have a high valuation number and be successful among the other tech and venture capital people. My view now is, I love the business that we have. Our business will never be as big as any of the businesses that we cover or study, and it affords me a much better life and probably a more interesting one where I get to study a broader set of things than just whatever one niche of one industry the successful business that you start happens to be in.
And as the universe has expanded from a subject matter perspective, have you gained an appreciation for things that were completely foreign to your reality before?
Absolutely. I think you're probably leading the witness, but
It's my show. I get to do that.
Yeah, I never appreciated durability, and in particular durability of story, the way that I do now. And interestingly, durability of story can show up in real tangible value for a company. To give an example, I think the thing that I used to be obsessed with and still am very interested in is what is the value provided by the current technology wave such that it will obsolete everything that came before it and reshape the world. And I think a thing that I had zero understanding of is how a company like Rolex or Hermes, somewhere between 100 and 200 years old, making the same promise to customers and keeping that promise over and over again, in the words of Warren Buffett, can build a brand and that brand can actually show up in a way that customers value. The reason that the average selling price of a Rolex watch is $13,000 is not because it's the best timekeeping device. It's because all that is Rolexness is worth $13,000 to people. And that is pretty far away from its utils, to use your phrase from earlier.
It's a different type of util. It is not an input-output util. You've done this series on what are very clearly luxury goods companies, the February episode for the last 3 years. Were there things that came up before that had precursors to this sort of storytelling?
I think so. If you look at the New York Times, their place in the world and what their value was to customers, Standard Oil had a bent of this where they extended out of just selling kerosene and selling sort of other goods and creating their own stores and extending the Standard Oil promise and what it meant to people. That standard, you can rely on it. It's what everyone else uses and it's the best on the market, that sort of thing. Luxury is a funny thing because it really takes this concept and blows it out of proportion. A leather handbag on average sells for 13 times more than it costs to make. That's like software margins. And so then the question is...
And there are marginal costs in producing the thing, and it's still
right.
Amazing margin.
And so I think the interesting question is, where did we study something where brand let you add a little bit of additional premium to the pure utility you were selling, but not what we see in a luxury world where because it's also has signaling value, you have this massive expansion of margin.
One of the things that I think you have focused on, which I think is really interesting, and I never thought about this distinction before LVMH, before Hermes, was this distinction between premium and luxury. How do you think about that? What is that distinction, and is that meaningful?
Yes. I should cite the person whose definition this is. I think it was in The Luxury Strategy, or maybe it was in the book Deluxe. It's in one of those two books, but there's a great definition that is, premium is a product for which when you pay more for it, you are also getting more utility out of it, more function out of it. And those things don't have to be one-to-one. When I get more memory in my phone, when I get more memory in my computer, Apple charges me absurd amounts for a trivial amount of cost in creating that memory. They're getting a great deal by me upgrading that computer that I'm buying from them. But it is premium. If I buy the top of the line laptop, it's premium because I got more utility for putting more dollars in, even though it's not linear. Luxury is quite the opposite. Luxury is when the function remains identical, but I'm willing to pay more for something. And that, of course, can come from a variety of factors, including I feel better about myself when I wear this. I feel this brand or object represents me better than quote unquote identical utility brand or objects. I believe other people will perceive me to be different because of this. But that's kind of the distinction. Am I getting more raw function out of the object or not? If so, premium, if not, luxury.
this is the difference between a Lexus and a Ferrari.
Yes.
In that definition is a bright line, and it equates some things to being objective improvements and some things to being, I don't know, hand-waving improvement. I don't know if it's that bright a line, right? We go from something where, I don't know, you and I both like charts, and we like to see, all right, you can graph something. But when we get into material culture, you get into these things that, maybe if you're being derisive or hand wavy, but when people start paying real money for something, I don't know, is that really hand wavy? I think one of the things that you did such a nice job in the Rolex episode is talking about how they found, I think you said found, but I would almost argue created a place in the market where you can sell a lot of things for a pretty big sum of money. There is real value that a lot of people are paying there. So I don't know. I'm just struggling with this idea that this is just some sort of hand-wavy thing when you get into the realm of luxury.
You often make the point to me, I think your counter-argument whenever I try and make this clear, bright line is that utility is not easily definable. Neither is function. And so just because this $1,000 handbag performs the same function as this $20,000 handbag, clearly there's additional function that the $20,000 handbag is performing, be it in terms of social status or even allowing you to participate in a community that you otherwise never would have, or to have something to talk about with a group of friends that you want to have something to talk about with, to mark an occasion that you otherwise would never mark. So it blurs the line of function or utility when literally paying more for something does actually provide you an additional piece of utility in life.
I think it does. There is this sort of idea that paying more for something actually changes the nature of the good. There's this sort of Veblennian idea.
Yep.
But I don't know. Maybe is it the price? Is it the object itself? We were just talking about the watches that we were wearing earlier today. And I am wearing a watch that was a gift from my father, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago.
Oh, a watch that I didn't know existed. I looked at your watch and I said, oh, it's a Rolex Datejust. And you said, no, it's a Rolex Date, which I just studied Rolex for months and had no idea this watch ever existed.
So this is a watch that my grandparents gave to my father around his 21st birthday. He couldn't remember if this was for his 21st birthday or for his college graduation, but at some point in that era. This is a mid to late 1970s piece. It is a 14-karat Rolex Date. This is apparently a watch that was only made for the American market, and it's nearly 50 years old. And I took it out of the safe this morning, and I wound it, and I set the time, and then I had to spend a whole bunch of time setting the date because it does not have a quick set date. But how many other things do I own? How many other things are in the lineage of my family that still do exactly the same thing that they were designed to do 50 years ago? None of us live in the same house. I certainly wasn't alive 50 years ago, but nobody has the same car. Nobody is living in the same place. We have no clothing from that period of time. And this object, which does one thing on one level, which is tell the time and the date, still does exactly the same thing. There's just something unique about that. I don't know what to make of it.
I'm trying to think through your postulate. Your shoes, I'm looking at them right now. They're nice sort of leather boots or sort of high top dress shoes. Those could have been worn 50 years ago. Jean style has changed significantly. The quarter zip that I see you wearing wasn't a thing. It's easy to say, oh, electronics in cars, no, we could never use the same thing. Safety standards and Moore's law and all that. Interestingly, clothing, like adornments in general, seem to be more durable. Like a white dress shirt. I could wear my grandpa's white dress shirt from 50 years ago for sure. Or if not, the ones I'm wearing that are new are identical to at least for a basic cotton dress shirt. But you're right. The watch is the most sophisticated thing that is the same today that it was 50 years ago.
And there's something about these iconic brands that got it right. There's something about the design that turns out to be enduring. So I put this watch on this morning, and I came upstairs, and Zoe, my 5-year-old daughter, goes, "Oh, I like your watch." And Julia, my wife, goes, "Oh, I love that watch. I'd wear that." And then I came over here, and your wife looked at this and said, "Oh, I really like that watch." What is it about this particular design that has lodged itself into the consciousness of the world, where people across genders, people across age ranges look at this and go, "Oh, this thing that's actually really old is still something desirable"?
This is the genius of Rolex on two levels. The first is they've kept the model lineup effectively the same for 70 years at this point. Since the mid 50s, once they figured out our core set of watches. Before that, they were producing all sorts of different shape sizes and not really naming any of them up through the 40s. But in the 50s, once they figured out, okay, the tool watches, those professional watches, then these are our sort of nicer dress watches or things that presidents would wear, things like that. They have had the good sense to essentially keep the lineup identical, very similar to Porsche. The 911 is the 911, and every 7 years, the 911 gets a little bit more modern, better engineered. The Rolex lineup is the same way. And so I would say one is it looks like a nice modern watch, or potentially a modern watch that is emulating a vintage watch, but it is in fact the authentic real vintage watch. So that's thing one. Thing two is Rolex managed to shape our idea of what watches are in the modern world in a way that if you went back 70 years and had the blank slate of what do you think watches look like, it was actually a pretty broad smattering of what a watch could look like. But now when you close your eyes and you say, what is a watch? And not a smartwatch, a watch that's made out of metal, that is something you would wear when you are either trying to look nice or trying to look presentable or just getting dressed for the day. You probably either picture something that looks like a Submariner or that looks like a Datejust. And in the very same way that when you close your eyes and say, picture a race car, you probably picture a Ferrari. Like Rolex managed to create the modern Platonic form of a watch.
Is that the indication of iconic brandhood when you are the kind of default assumption in people's minds?
I think so, so long as you can manage to associate the form, that figure, when people close their eyes with your brand. Yeah, I suppose there's a way where you could accidentally create the form of something that 90% of people believe is the standard, but then you don't have the ability to uniquely differentiate your product, and everyone there. Somehow a Submariner does feel different enough than other dive watches where you're like, oh, that's the real thing that everything else is trying to approximate.
There's this fascinating thing in the development of these brands that today you look at them and they feel inevitable. Maybe that's the nature of history, that we know which way the world moved. But there was a fascinating statistic that you mentioned in the Rolex episode about awareness of the product. And I think it was in the United States.
Yeah.
And over the course of a decade, it went from
2 decades.
2 in 10. Was that what it was?
Yep.
2 in 10 Americans knew Rolex to 8 in 10, or maybe even more.
Yep. And it was mid 70s to mid 90s, went from 20% brand awareness, unaided brand awareness, to 80% unaided brand awareness.
And so these things that feel inevitable, these things that seem like they come out of a very particular space and time, are actually the product of a lot of really purposeful action on part of the company. Obviously, those things are helped by things that happen in culture. I'm always fascinated by whether luxury brands can only come out of Europe and can only come out of a particular place in time. All of these things that we're talking about are either 19th century or early 20th century products of Germany, France, Switzerland,
Italy.
Yeah.
But that's it.
Why?
It's such a good question. I'll give you the best pitch for something that should come close and somehow just isn't. If you look at Japan, they have just as rich of a tradition of craftsmanship, businesses that are owned by 15th generation family members.
Histories in some cases.
They produce things such as watches, spirits, beautiful garments and adornments, have as long of a country history and an obsession with perfecting processes as anyone in Switzerland or Germany would ever claim. And yet, there's something about this European 18th, 19th century craftsmanship that holds a different place and that people place a different value on than even what I would argue should be the next closest competitor, or frankly, with Japanese engineering, precision, craftsmanship, should even surpass a lot of these European luxury brands, and yet it hasn't. I don't really have a good answer for why, other than we live in this like Anglo-white dominated world where we believe that things that came out of Europe during the time of the British Empire and when Europe ruled the world is de facto superior, and it feels crass to say it or even unfortunate to say it. I think that's probably the best reason I can come up with, because there's nothing intrinsic about the quality of that leather or the quality of those ticking time telling devices.
No, it's the quality of that dream. And somehow that dream seems to be more easily associated with particular cultures than another.
Yeah, you're right. And maybe European brands have been better at the process of selling that dream, that there's like a industrialization of marketing that dream that no one else has ever been able to quite nail. Certainly not in America, because we're just not as old, so we don't have as much tradition to rely on. But on comparably historical cultures from elsewhere, they just haven't been as competent at selling the dream as the Europeans are. Maybe.
So you have now lived in some of these worlds for periods of time. Are you more compelled by the idea of owning something from Hermes or something from Rolex than you would have been 3 years ago?
Yes, but my answer is idiosyncratic in a way. I like owning these things because they're part of the acquired podcast canon. Like, I own an Hermes belt and I wear it when I want to look nice. And my wife owns some scarves. And after doing the Rolex episode, I'd like to go celebrate. It's our biggest episode ever. We're going to be doing something very fun this summer where we'll likely create a lot of media artifacts out of it. And I feel like I should be wearing a Rolex at that because it's part of acquired canon. I have an appreciation for other brands too. I really want a Grand Seiko Spring Drive. I really want an Omega Speedmaster. And yet, because they're not part of acquired canon, that doesn't feel like the timepiece that I should go buy soon.
Maybe I'll be a little provocative there. Is that a utilitarian consideration? All right, that the story that I have created is...
I mean, it's totally feelings based. I would feel odd walking into something that should feel like what we did at Chase Center, this sort of Super Bowl of acquiredness last summer. And thank you for coming down at the last second and then catching a 5 a.m. flight out the next morning to go reunite with your family. It would have been weird for me to be wearing a Louis Vuitton belt. There's something where we've also covered them, but like it's very clear that Hermes is where my heart lies in that category. And so I think it's a feelings thing. It's not utilitarian.
You think about what you do as a craft. Is that accurate?
For sure.
And does that help you appreciate crafts in other realms?
Oh, absolutely. We were watching the Oscars last night, and the name of the Best Picture winner, what is it? Honora. Hadn't seen the movie, hadn't even heard of the movie, because I have a 15-month-old, and so you don't do things like go to movie theaters in this phase of life. And the person comes up for winning Best Cinematographer, or maybe no, Best Film Editor. And
who was the director?
He's making fun of the director of the movie. He's saying, oh, God, all the work had to be done in the edit room. The director had no idea what he was doing, so I think I saved the movie. Then he wins, I think, Best Director, and he walks up later, and it's the same guy. And I'm like, oh, my God, this guy is the director. He's the editor. He's the auteur. He had the singular vision, and the reason that this film is so cohesive and outlierish and brilliant, and I haven't even seen it, is because of his sort of singular obsession and creation of it, where he oversaw it end to end. And there's something really beautiful about that. I appreciate that more than I ever thought I would, because we try to do as much as possible with Acquired. The reason why we're able to do 12 episodes a year is because we do actually have an editor who goes through, doesn't make the content decisions, but really streamlines the edit process. But that's our one indulgence. Other than that, David and I are research, recording, producing each other back and forth while we're recording, listening with an ear for retake this, retake that. And then I was trying to look at the number of edits I made. I think it was about 800-900 edits on top of our editor's edits for, hey, this sentence should stay and this sentence should go.
When I asked you right after you recorded the episode, how'd it go? You said, I think it was really good. It was 9 hours to begin with. So 4 hours of this got left on the cutting room floor.
Hopefully the worst 4.
Yeah, but it feels like a conversation, and it is a conversation, but it's a conversation that has been very carefully and purposefully pruned.
Yeah. And if, like anyone who's edited anything, papers, audio, video out there who's listening will appreciate, you get done with the first edit and it feels bad. Like you feel like you cut some stuff you wanted to keep, but you know there's still meat on the bone. And it's the second and third edit where you're cutting things that you really would have loved in the spirit of keeping the story as tight as possible. That's when you know you really made a good episode, is when you're getting all the way to the bone.
Tech has this interesting relationship with fashion. And we were looking earlier at the archives of your watch collection.
If you can call it that.
And you have a original Apple Watch. And when we look back to what Johnny Ive was doing at that point, he thought about this as a fashion object. I'm not sure that's what it turned out to be. They did the edition. There was an 18-karat version.
Yes.
Beyonce had one with a gold bracelet.
Yep.
It seems like we use this now for measuring our workouts and making sure that we're sleeping appropriately. What is this relationship between tech and fashion?
First, I'll say the exception that breaks the rule here, or proves, I've never known that phrase, but Oprah walks on stage last night, and she's with Whoopi Goldberg giving out an Oscar. And I had been paying attention to everyone's watches all night because I'm in this world right now, and there's this $100,000 and this $500,000 watch and this and that and the other thing. Oprah walks on stage wearing an Apple Watch. I could not believe it. So setting that aside, because that's an exception, they launched the Apple Watch with a belief that it could be good for lots of things. And I think they just didn't know. And frankly, if they thought they were going to go directly after the fitness market at the time, I don't think you would have been able to predict how ubiquitous that would have been, because you would have looked at the Fitbit market and the, what are some other companies that were going after that at the time? It's telling that I can't remember their names off the top of my head, but it was a niche market. It turns out the way that Apple made that product, it's actually a gigantic market, selling, 60 million of these watches a year. They thought maybe there's a fashion angle. Maybe we can participate in the high-end Swiss category and sell a $10,000 version of this. That was wrong. They thought this could be a great app platform, much like the phone. That was essentially wrong. It's great for notifications, but no one's really using Apple Watch apps, or certainly intentionally launching them, other than I use it for Strava, for runs. But again, it's that fitness purpose. So yeah, it's notification center and it's health. Interestingly, they're able to charge $1,000 for that. That is more expensive than, it's 20 times more expensive than many Fossil watches and Swatches. And yet we think about it as not a luxury object.
Apple has done the same thing that Rolex has done, in that they have found or created a very large market space charging premium or very relatively high prices for something.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that is demand generation. We are creating something that is a must-have.
I think that the Apple Watch ended up being useful enough that it comes down to a pretty simple question. Do I feel like I'm missing something important when I'm not wearing it? Yes. Okay. I'm willing to spend a certain amount of my disposable income on that thing. And frankly, you only need to upgrade it like once every 5 years. And so it's a reasonable enough purchase, whether you're getting the entry-level model or the Ultra 2. Where I think they fell on their faces, and we didn't talk about this in the Rolex episode, but they had a huge miss with the Apple Watch Edition. And I'm surprised that they didn't see it coming, because the reason why I'm willing to spend $8, $10, $20,000 on a Rolex watch is because I am certain it will be worth that going forward or more, if not for the raw resale value, which is a huge part of it, then certainly for the sentimental value. You wearing that Rolex date and having the story behind it, it's an interesting and coveted piece. The initial Apple Watch that I have, I think that's the stainless steel version. There was aluminum, a steel, and a gold. The steel version that I have there is worthless. And if I had the gold version there, it would be whatever the liquidation value of gold is. And it's not that much gold. And so there's an obsolescence that comes from technology, especially digital technology, that just didn't happen in the mechanical watch world. And that was a gross miscalculation.
There are ways in which that nature of the product allows us to justify, pull forward spending from some period of time. We were talking earlier about, does it make sense for us to buy mechanical watches to give to our children at some point down the line? I have no doubt that this watch will continue to do the thing that it does in 20 years. I cannot wrap my mind around what other objects my children are going to be carrying in 20 years. Are they smart glasses? Are they smart watches? What is going to be their computing platform? But I can justify, or maybe I just have justified a lot of times, spending money on a particular thing based on this idea that it's going to continue to do whatever it does ad infinitum.
Well, a lot of people are very comfortable buying MSRP mechanical watches because they assume that because they have only increased in value over time, they will only increase in value over time. And it'll be interesting to look.
It happened in the past, and we just draw lines into the future. That's how the future works.
Put the question back to you. What's a category where people were really sure about that because of 50 years of history of it being the same, and then it suddenly actually became worthless or decimated in value?
It's a good question. I don't know.
Someone threw out to me pens, ink. What's the correct?
Fountain pens.
Fountain pens.
Yeah.
But it's actually hard to think of things that used to universally be believed to be valuable, even though they had outlived their function. I think that's the interesting part about this, is the mechanical watch.
They had outlived a function. I want to
be
function. Persnickety about this a little bit.
Fair point. But the function, that initial function, has a really grounded value to it. This secondary function, it feels, this new market that mechanical watches found, this new purpose that they serve, it feels scarier to bet the farm that they'll stay valuable as something that is a little bit more fluid than just defining it as a time-telling device.
I think there are probably a lot of collectibles that fall into that department. Yeah. And I don't know what things our parents were collecting, but I don't know, I just got a box of stuff from my parents who were cleaning out their basement. I have all these baseball cards. And my son and I are looking through all these baseball cards, and the pieces from the late 80s and early 90s are apparently effectively worthless because this was an era that has come to be known as the junk wax era. That this was the height of demand for baseball cards. This is like when we were kids. People wanted baseball cards. And so lots of people made baseball cards. And so that was like the height of the number of baseball cards ever produced. And I don't know, my mother thought that I was somehow going to retire off of a 91 score complete set. Is now worth nothing. And so they're, I don't know, joke about Beanie Babies and all those sort of things.
My first ever entrepreneurial venture was selling my Beanie Babies on eBay. I got $350 for one, $100 for another, and $100 for another one. And I remember then I was 8, 10, something like that. And it's funny that I remember the numbers. And I remember the $350 was a Jerry Garcia bear, and Coral and Inch, the fish and the worm, were the 100s. Anyway, that market obviously way smaller than it was at the peak of its mania. Mechanical watches did peak in 2022. There was a bubble that popped, but the drawdown was only 30 to 50%, depending on which watch you had. The drawdown was not 99%, like it is for a lot of these other collectibles. And that says something pretty interesting, that the drawdown found its floor at a pretty, if you looked back it lost like 1, maybe 2 years of incremental value, but not the whole mountain of run up.
Another category, something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, is lab-grown diamonds. And this interesting intersection between technology and luxury, or technology and rarity, or whatever you want to call it. My sense is that you really enjoyed the process of looking for a diamond.
Oh, I loved it.
And there was something that was like intrinsically interesting about that. What was it about that process? And then maybe we'll go from there into lab-grown diamonds.
The best part about it was that you were my shepherd. When I was buying an engagement ring for my now wife, we were going over to your house. We were like looking at diamonds under a microscope. We were actually seeing the GIA certification number. But yeah, I also enjoy doing my own research of learning color, cut, clarity, and carat.
You got it.
Understanding each of those, understanding the curve of sometimes these things go up in value because of something intrinsic. Sometimes it's supply-demand curve driven. I found it absolutely fascinating that for something like clarity, you're paying incrementally for how flawless the diamond is, whereas with something like a yellow diamond, you aren't necessarily paying because it's better, you're paying because it's rare. And you have to decide where you want to spend your marginal dollars. Is it on rarity or is it on some intrinsic quality, whatever that means to you? So yes, I found the whole thing fascinating. And at some point, I definitely called you and said, there's a curve that looks very similar to Moore's Law, which is the decrease in price over time of lab cut diamonds versus where they were 5, 10, 20 years ago. And geez, if you project that into the near future, why am I buying a natural diamond? And you had a great comment back to me, which was, there are a fixed amount of natural diamonds that they can pull out of the earth in total, and a very fixed amount each year based on the amount of production and mining capacity. So we know the rarity of a natural diamond. What we don't know is how much people will care about that, but that's for you to decide between the two. Is, do you care about something that you guarantee will have a fixed supply, whereas it is totally reasonable to project the costs of a lab cut diamond down to near zero at some point. And I think the most fascinating thing is that in this category, you truly can't tell the difference. And you're never going to ask, and no one's ever going to, it's not like it says it on the garment the way that it does with fashion.
That's the question that I keep coming back to, is, are these things different? And I have been very inculcated in a traditional world of, these are rare, these are the product of hundreds of millions or billions of years in the earth, and that is the reason why they are special. And I believe that. I have bought into that. Does that continue? And I don't know, there's something about this kind of watch analog which is interesting. We've talked about how increasingly there are dupes of some of these high-end watches that are very high quality.
Amazing. Indiscernible unless you are a true expert.
Right. So obviously that is a different thing. A Rolex dupe was not made in the Rolex factory. It was made in a different way. But at some point, does it approach what a lab-grown diamond is? Is a lab-grown diamond the same thing as a natural diamond? Chemically, it is mostly indiscernible, and it was made in a completely different way. Does that make it the same or different is actually a marketing question. It's actually a consumer perception question.
And what mattered to me when I was making the decision on the engagement ring was, will my fiance perceive that that I'm really invested? And if I bought something 1/6 the price, it's a thinner argument that this is a really meaningful thing I'm getting. And so to me, what mattered was, does she perceive it to be meaningful? And I think part of that, if you go one step further, is, will she always perceive it to be meaningful? And that's a little bit scary, because if you're hinging that too much extrinsically of, oh, will other people know that this is a nice ring, that could change over time. But one thing that won't change over time is, she will always remember that it was meaningful when I made that investment in our relationship. So that ultimately, I think that is what it comes down to, or that's how I got comfortable with buying a natural diamond.
everything is symbolic to
Right.
a certain degree, right? We imbue value into objects. I guess maybe that is the thesis of, I was going to say this podcast, but maybe it's the thesis of my life, that people create things with intention and certain people find value in it, whether it is art, whether it is culture or commerce. These are all things that we find particular value in. And I don't know, I think that is the job of the entrepreneur, is to create something that finds a market niche. And I think it's one of the things that you and David have done uniquely well with Acquired is, here is something that there was absolutely no market demand for ex ante. If you were to have done market research and you would have asked a million of the most intelligent, plugged-in people in the world, do you want to listen to 5 hours of us talking about Rolex? The answer would have been definitively no. But they didn't know what this was because you hadn't created it yet. And I think that's the nature of entrepreneurship generally. I think it's the nature of entrepreneurship, particularly in consumer categories, is we don't know what we want until we're presented with something that's super compelling, and then you can't imagine your life at anything different.
Yeah. And to back up it's what you've been doing with your whole life. It's what I do with my life now too. Everything is story. But these episodes aren't compelling because we do the best margin analysis on why they can eke out dollars over their competitors. They're compelling because you really understand the story of how these companies became who they are in the world.
And there's a big audience for that. People like to understand the world. We see these things around us and you wonder, how did that come to be?
Worse, you don't. I think that's one of the big things I've learned is most people just look at things and assume they always were. That building's always been there. That company's always been big. No, that company was just recently not a startup. If you were inside, you felt like, in many cases, you still feel like, Jensen Huang told me, I'm worried NVIDIA is going out of business tomorrow. Guess what? NVIDIA is not going out of business tomorrow, but he feels that way. And that is not in any way the way that the general public perceives these institutions.
But he's right in the general sense. Right? I am a very strong adherent to the theory of creative destruction, and that the economy moves forward by better ideas coming along and knocking something off. The world as it is today is fundamentally different than it was a generation ago, and the world a generation hence will be different still. Will some of these companies continue to be successful? I don't know. Microsoft is an example, one that we've talked about a lot. Microsoft is an extraordinary company that is in an incredible position today, far more profitable than it was 25 years ago.
When it was in its heyday.
But 25 years ago, it was the only one. And so now it is one of a forest of trees that have grown to the sky.
Yeah. It is funny you highlight this idea that, like, these companies, I think about the late 90s as Microsoft's heyday. I think about the early 2010s when the iPhone was blowing up as Apple's heyday. The list goes on. These companies are 10 times more valuable now, and in Microsoft's 20 times more valuable than they were in their quote-unquote heyday. Mars Candies, when Forrest Mars Jr. was running that company, that was the heyday. Figuring out Snickers, figuring out M&Ms, that's the best story. But then he retired and his kids took it over, and it's 10 times more valuable today than when his kids took it over. And what did his kids do? They launched it internationally. They did the next logical business decision. It wasn't maverick stuff like in the early days where we're so excited about it. So I think that there's an interesting lesson, which is things can get way bigger than you ever imagined when they penetrate globally, even though the core concept is actually the same as it was 20 years ago.
And in a lot of those cases, we go from an entrepreneurial company to a professional company.
Yeah.
And there's always this fatalism around what's going to happen to Apple after Steve is gone.
It's going to get 10 times more valuable.
Right. What's going to happen to Walmart after Sam is gone? It's probably 20 or 50 times more valuable.
Yeah. As long as the thing that made it special is deeply ingrained enough in the company to keep it going.
Are there cases where that hasn't happened?
I'm certain. Acquired is a story of survivorship bias. So all the companies I study are the ones that are like currently the most successful. The Lindy effect plays a big role. The longer something was true, the longer it tends to stay true. So the best examples that come to mind are ones that were new and spiked in popularity, but then once they lost a founder or didn't have the next hit product, they fell off quickly. Thinking of Sega or some other recent darlings. I don't know. Yes, but I don't know them as well.
I think your point about the survivorship bias is right, but I think that the overall trend is things actually do die. I don't know.
Yeah.
I have spent my life in the retail world, and you can chart history based on who was the biggest retailer in the world, and they seem inviolable until the next thing comes along that's just better. Sears, Woolworth, Walmart, Amazon, you can't wrap your mind around how somebody is going to create a better mousetrap until they do.
Yep.
And then obviously it was inevitable because look at all of the dumb things that they did. Don't build the biggest building in the world. I think that was a lesson for a long time.
Yeah, or at least the way that David and I have thought about it with Acquired is don't take on a overhead and cost structure that requires you to be as successful as you are today forever, because at some point you won't be. And so your durability comes from your ability to withstand these big drawdowns or big changes in the market or big shifts in technology that make a big part of your cost structure unnecessary. Or I don't know what we'll end up adapting to as the world drifts toward more AI-driven content or AI-driven research or AI-driven visuals to accompany our audio or things like that. But I do know that by us trying to be as scrappy as possible and keep our overhead low, we'll be the most adaptable to it as it comes.
And you have created a brand. And if there's anything that we have learned from all of these companies over time, it's that being the gold standard is very valuable. And you get the first opportunity at the next listenership. I'm sure there are lots of great podcasts that I don't listen to. And when you come out with a new episode, I listen to it because I trust you. You have earned that over time. And so that's why there are compounding benefits to some of these things.
Yeah, someone pitched me this idea the other day that I sure hope is true, which is as content becomes more abundant with AI-generated content, trust actually becomes the scarce commodity. Like Acquired could get more valuable because there's an abundance of content out there because we're curators.
Yeah. It's the hypothesis behind At Present. It is not a lack of good things that exist in the world. It is a lack of trust around where do I find these things. And if there's tens of millions of products on Etsy or on Amazon, maybe one of those things is good, but I really don't know, and I'm not willing to risk it. I'm not going to listen to a 5-hour AI-generated podcast. It might be 10 times better than what it is that you are going to create, but I'm just not going to trust that I'm going to invest my most valuable resource, my time, in listening to that.
It's so funny in your world, too. Let's say I did manage to succeed in the massive triage of Amazon, Etsy, just looking for maybe there's some third-party seller on one of these sites that's really created this unbelievably high-quality product. If I succeed in finding them and investing the thousands of hours, I might get it, but still actually not be sure because the intrinsic quality is not necessarily knowable. I am looking for, at present, to help me understand the story behind it and the level of quality that exists here. And when you buy something without a whole lot of story behind it and a whole lot of understanding and a whole lot of vetting, and you may be holding the product in your hand and still be unsure.
Yeah.
And if a lot of the value comes from, I love a thing I own, you actually need help in the story of making sure you love the thing.
It's a little bit like travel. We were just in Mexico City with my wife and kids, and I've always been a little bit skeptical about tour guides. And when you go somewhere for the first time, it's actually useful for someone to guide you in the right direction and to go, oh, all right, these are the things that I want to make sure that I see, and I'm going to provide the frame to help you understand this. And so I think that my skepticism about that has probably gone down. I'm the sort of person who would like to land somewhere and just start walking around. And I think I miss things. because I actually don't have the context for what I am seeing and how this fits together. Even though all of this information exists in the world, and could ChatGPT give me a 10-page dossier on things that I need to see in Mexico City and the way to understand the urban development and whatever? Probably. I still think there's value for a human curator there.
Yep. Totally believe it.
What's next?
It's been hard to leave the world of watches.
Is that surprising?
We do have a next episode, but I'm actually finding it hard to research that, and I find myself watching that next YouTube video on watches. So there are certain episodes where I fall in love with the category, and there are certain ones where I'm interested in the business, but once we finish the episode, I'm moving on to the next. And Rolex definitely fell into the category of I'm still researching even though the episode is done. I'll probably lose a lot of hours and dollars to this hobby in the future.
Yeah, there are worse things to lose time and money too. My sense is that you evaluate your performance against a couple of different metrics when you do these things. One is, did the general audience come to appreciate this? That people who are non-specialists listen to this and go, oh, this is a really interesting story. I like this.
Yep.
But more so, people who are deeply ingrained in this world listen to it and they go, oh, I think you got it. And my sense is that the watch community really liked this episode. You think that's true?
Oh, for sure. I was afraid of reading responses on the Hodinkee article on it, or you sent me the Rolex subreddit thread, or some of the Rolex forums. And I was delighted to see that you've won in the watch world, where someone says, the thing you missed is that actually Roger Moore's James Bond briefly did wear a Seiko. And you said that he only wore Rolexes all the way up to 95 when Pierce Brosnan took over. And I'm like, oh, good. We nailed it then. If that's the thing that's being pointed out, we did not miss the important big picture element. The way I always describe it is we make the episodes for the smart general public listener. You don't have to be an enthusiast or an expert. In fact, we aren't doing our jobs if we're making it only for the enthusiast or expert. We want to take out as much jargon as possible, but we sure as hell need the enthusiast to believe that we were correct, because otherwise the whole thing is built on a farce if the people who know it the best don't think that we nailed it.
This podcast is called The Materialist. Would you describe yourself as a materialist?
No, but I think it's likely because I believe that word has negative connotation. If I actually thought about what does materialist mean, do I like fine materials? Yes. But do I define myself by my material possessions, or am I obsessed with letting that represent me in the world? I don't think so, but that's going not on the definition, but on the connotation.
Yeah. Hard to separate one from the other.
I do define myself by the brands I surround myself with. And that's more of a theoretical thing than a materialist thing. But I love consistency, reliability, quality. Like, I own a zillion Apple products, and if I got a tattoo, it would probably be of an Apple logo. I go to Starbucks every single day. I have always banked at Chase. There's certain things that I just trust, they're reliable. And if I could build a constellation of brands around myself. I actually think the brands would represent me pretty well. I love my Trek bicycle, and these brands are pretty important to me, and I do let them represent me.
Are those premium brands? Are they luxury brands?
I think I define myself by enjoying ultra premium products. I'm uncomfortable with the idea of defining myself with luxury products.
Luxury has the same sort of connotation challenges that materialist does.
For sure.
People either want to wrap themselves in that blanket or they want to run as far away from it. And whenever you have a situation like that, it probably means the term has lost any descriptive value.
But here's another one. You and I live in a nice neighborhood in Seattle. I like defining myself by living here because it's a really nice place to live. I don't necessarily want to advertise this is my neighborhood and enough about me just because I hate that, but I freaking love living here.
Yeah.
In the same way that I freaking love having the top of the line MacBook.
Things that are nice for a reason, and they're desirable for a reason. It's because they do tend to provide lasting value.
Yep.
Ben, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for continuing to put great things into the world and continuing to expand the world that we all get to join you on as you go on these journeys.
Thanks, Marc. Pleasure to be on.
That's it for this episode of The Materialist. A special thanks to Ben Gilbert for his insight on the world of brand building and materialism, and for welcoming me to the ACQ Global Headquarters. If you like The Materialist, please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you haven't listened, check out Acquired. So many wonderful and fascinating stories going back over the course of the last 10 years. The Materialist is a presentation of At Present, matchmaker to extraordinary jewelry. Please visit us at www.atpresent.com. Until next time,